The small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, had never been the kind of place that made national headlines. Nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, it was a community where people still left their doors unlocked at night and where everybody knew your name and your business. The kind of place where the most exciting thing to happen might be a new stop sign, or perhaps the occasional high school football championship. But on November 5, 2002, all of that changed. Election day dawned crisp and clear in Millfield. The morning air carried the distinct scent of autumn decaying leaves, wood smoke from early season fires, and that particular sharpness that heralded the coming winter. Flags fluttered outside the Millfield Community Center, the largest polling location in the county, as voters lined up to cast their ballots in the midterm elections. Among them was 34-year-old Elaine Hartman, a registered nurse at Millfield Memorial Hospital and mother to 12-year-old Thomas. Dressed in blue scrubs, she was heading to her shift directly after voting. Elaine arrived at the community center just after 7:30 a.m. Security footage would later show her checking in with poll workers, receiving her ballot, and walking toward the privacy booth set up in the gymnasium. It was the last time anyone would ever see Elaine Hartman. The community center's security cameras captured her entering the gymnasium at 7:42 a.m. They never recorded her leaving. By all accounts, Elaine Hartman had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a half-completed ballot in voting booth number 7 and a son who would spend the next 14 years searching for answers. Thomas Hartman had always been an early riser, just like his mother. On the morning of November 5th, he woke up before his alarm, dressed himself for school, and headed downstairs to find his mother already in the kitchen, stirring pancake batter. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, though Thomas had been anything but. This was their ritual. She would always call him sleepyhead, no matter how early he rose, and he would always roll his eyes in response, though secretly, he loved their inside joke. Elaine Hartman was a petite woman, standing just over 5 feet tall. With chestnut hair she kept tucked in a practical bob. Friends and colleagues often described her as the calm in the storm, a fitting description for both her professional demeanor as an ER nurse and her approach to single motherhood. Thomas's father had left when Thomas was just 3 years old. He had vague memories of a tall man with a deep laugh, but little else. The photograph Elaine kept on the mantel showed a handsome man with Thomas's same hazel eyes, but he was essentially a stranger. Elaine never spoke ill of him, only saying that sometimes people aren't ready for the lives they find themselves living. She had raised Thomas alone, working 12-hour shifts at the hospital while somehow never missing a parent-teacher conference or baseball game. That morning, as they sat eating pancakes at their small kitchen table, Elaine reminded Thomas that she would be voting before her shift. "Mrs. Donovan is going to drop you off at school today," she said, referring to their next-door neighbor. "I will pick you up after my shift, and we can rent that movie you have been wanting to see." Thomas nodded, his mouth full of pancake. The movie was Spider-Man, which had come out earlier that year, but they hadn't had a chance to watch yet. He'd been lobbying for it for weeks, and Elaine had finally given in. "I will be home by 8, Elaine promised, ruffling his hair as she stood to clear their plates. "Do your homework before I get home and we will have time for popcorn too." These were the last words she would ever speak to her son. When Thomas arrived home from school that afternoon, he was surprised to find not his mother, but his Aunt Diane sitting at the kitchen table. Diane's eyes were red, and Sheriff Holbrook, a man Thomas knew from community events and his youth baseball league, stood awkwardly by the sink, his hat in his hands. "Hey buddy," Sheriff Holbrook said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Why don't you come sit down for a minute?" Thomas's world shifted on its axis that afternoon, as the adults explained, in halting, careful terms, that his mother had disappeared. She had gone to vote that morning, but never arrived at work. Nobody had seen her leave the community center. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her purse was found inside voting booth number 7, along with a ballot that had only been partially completed. Like she just vanished? Thomas asked, unable to process what they were telling him. "We are doing everything we can to find her," Sheriff Holbrook assured him, though his expression betrayed his bewilderment. People didn't just disappear from polling places in small towns like Millfield, not without someone seeing something. But as the initial hours of the investigation would reveal, no one had seen anything at all. The first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation are critical. Evidence is freshest, memories are clearest, and if foul play is involved, the perpetrator has had less time to cover their tracks. Sheriff Jeffrey Holbrook knew this all too well, despite having never handled a case quite like Elaine Hartman's. Millfield's police department consisted of the sheriff and 5 deputies, none of whom had experience with disappearances beyond the occasional runaway teenager. This was immediately different. Elaine Hartman was by all accounts a devoted mother and dedicated nurse with no history of mental health issues, substance abuse, or any behavior that might suggest she would abandon her life voluntarily. Within hours of the report, Sheriff Holbrook had secured the community center as a crime scene, called in assistance from the state police, and organized search parties to comb the surrounding areas. Security footage was collected and reviewed repeatedly. Witnesses, poll workers, and voters who had been present that morning were interviewed. The facts as they emerged were these. Elaine Hartman had arrived at the community center at 7:31 a.m., according to security footage from the parking lot. She had checked in with poll workers at 7:38 a.m., showing her driver's license and signing the voter roll. Poll worker Deborah Fleming remembered Elaine clearly, as they knew each other from the hospital where Deborah volunteered. She was in her scrubs, seemed perfectly normal, Deborah would tell investigators. She asked how my husband was doing after his surgery, and I said he was recovering well. She smiled and said she was glad to hear it. That was it, just a normal, friendly exchange. At 7:42 a.m., security cameras captured Elaine entering the gymnasium where the voting booths were set up. The booths themselves were not visible on camera due to privacy laws surrounding the voting process. What happened next remained unclear. The gymnasium had 2 exits, the main doors through which Elaine had entered, and emergency exit doors that led to the building's rear parking lot. The main doors were visible on camera, and footage showed no sign of Elaine leaving through them. The emergency exit was not covered by security cameras, but poll workers insisted it had remained closed all morning and would have triggered an alarm if opened. At 8:15 a.m., a voter named Gerald Meeks entered booth number 7 and discovered Elaine's purse on the small shelf inside the booth, along with a ballot that had been filled out for only 2 races. He immediately alerted poll workers, who contacted the sheriff's office. Inside Elaine's purse were her wallet, containing $42 in cash, credit cards, and ID, her car keys, a tube of lip balm, a pack of tissues, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, and her flip phone. The phone's last activity had been a text message to her sister Diane at 7:15 a.m. Heading to vote, then to work. See you tomorrow for lunch? Elaine's Honda Civic was found in the community center parking lot, locked, with nothing out of the ordinary inside. The only items of note were a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder, still warm when discovered, and a novel on the passenger seat with a bookmark about halfway through. By all indications, Elaine Hartman had walked into voting booth number 7 and simply disappeared. The investigation expanded rapidly. State police brought in forensic teams to process the voting booth and surrounding areas. The booth itself yielded few clues. Elaine's fingerprints were found as expected, along with those of poll workers who had set up the booths and previous voters. The half-completed ballot showed votes for 2 down-ticket races, but nothing for the higher-profile congressional seat that had been the focal point of the election. The emergency exit doors were examined thoroughly. They showed no signs of having been tampered with, and the alarm system was verified to be functioning properly. If the doors had been opened, an alarm would have sounded throughout the building. Outside, search dogs were brought in to track Elaine's scent. They followed her trail from her car to the community center entrance, but could not pick up any trail leading away from the building. Extensive searches of the surrounding area, including wooded land behind the community center, nearby neighborhoods, and local waterways, yielded nothing. As days passed with no sign of Elaine, the investigation began to consider more improbable scenarios. The community center's ventilation system and crawl spaces were examined. The possibility that she might have hidden somewhere in the building was investigated, though a thorough search had already been conducted. Investigators even considered whether she might have disguised herself and walked out through the main entrance, though the security footage showed no one matching her build leaving the building, disguised or otherwise. Sheriff Holbrook organized press conferences, appealing to the public for information. Elaine's photograph was displayed on local news stations and in newspapers. A dedicated tip line was established. While numerous calls came in, none provided actionable leads. 1 week after Elaine's disappearance, the FBI became involved. Special Agent Catherine Walsh, a specialist in unusual disappearances, arrived in Millfield and brought fresh eyes to the case. "What we have here is a closed-room mystery," she told Sheriff Holbrook during their first meeting. "People don't vanish without a trace in the real world. There's always something, a fiber, a witness who saw something they didn't realize was important, a pattern that becomes visible only when you step back far enough to see it." Under Agent Walsh's guidance, the investigation methodically expanded its focus beyond the immediate circumstances of the disappearance. They began looking into Elaine's life in greater detail, her relationships, her finances, her past. Interviews with colleagues at Millfield Memorial revealed Elaine to be a respected nurse with no known enemies. Her supervisor, Dr. Michael Leary, described her as the most reliable person on staff, and universally liked co-workers, expressed shock and concern, unable to imagine why anyone would want to harm her. Elaine's financial records showed a woman living within her means. She had modest savings, a mortgage on her small 3-bedroom home, and typical credit card usage. There were no large withdrawals or deposits, no sudden changes in spending patterns, nothing to suggest financial trouble or preparations for disappearing voluntarily. Her phone records revealed a small but consistent social circle, regular calls and texts with her sister Diane, a few close friends, and frequent communication with the hospital. There were no unknown numbers, no unusual patterns of communication, no signs of a secret life. The investigation looked into Thomas's father, David Reynolds, who had left the family 9 years earlier. He was located in Arizona, remarried with 2 stepchildren. Flight records and witness statements confirmed he had been in Phoenix at the time of Elaine's disappearance, removing him as a suspect. As the investigation broadened, it also encountered the limitations of a small town's resources. Millfield had never dealt with a case of this magnitude before. Evidence processing was slow, manpower was limited, and as days turned into weeks, the initial urgency inevitably began to wane. For 12-year-old Thomas, watching the investigation unfold was like observing a machine gradually lose power. The first few days had seen frantic activity, police cars with flashing lights, search parties combing the woods, his mother's face on every television screen. But as November turned to December with no breaks in the case, he could sense the change. Fewer officers at the house, longer intervals between updates, the sympathetic but increasingly helpless expressions on Sheriff Holbrook's face. "We are not giving up, son," the sheriff would assure him during his weekly visits to Diane's house, where Thomas was now living. Sometimes these things take time, but even at 12, Thomas understood what wasn't being said. The trail was going cold. The mystery of what had happened to his mother in voting booth number 7 was no closer to being solved. By the 6-month mark, the active investigation had been significantly scaled back. Agent Walsh had returned to Quantico, though she remained in contact with Sheriff Holbrook. The tip line, once staffed around the clock, now forwarded to an answering machine. Elaine's case file remained open, but new leads were rare. Life in Millfield had largely returned to normal, or rather, it had settled into a new normal that accommodated the unsolved mystery in its midst. The community center had reopened after 2 weeks of being a crime scene. Voting booth number 7 had been replaced entirely, the old one stored as evidence in the sheriff's department. People still talked about the case, still wondered what had happened, but the initial fear and fascination had dulled with time. For Thomas, nothing would ever be normal again. He had moved in permanently with his Aunt Diane, who had converted her home office into a bedroom for him. Diane was Elaine's older sister, a high school English teacher who had never married or had children of her own. She did her best for her nephew, but both of them felt the gaping absence of Elaine in their lives. Thomas returned to school 3 weeks after his mother's disappearance. The principal had suggested a longer break, but Thomas had insisted. "Mom would want me to keep going," he'd said with a determination that both impressed and broke Diane's heart. At school, he endured the awkward silence that fell over classrooms when he entered, the too careful way teachers spoke to him, the curious stares from other students. Some were kind, bringing him cookies or offering to help with homework. Others whispered theories when they thought he couldn't hear. "I heard she ran away with some doctor. My dad says they found blood in that voting booth. What if she's, like in the witness protection program?" Thomas learned to tune them out, to focus on his schoolwork, to put one foot in front of the other each day. But at night, alone in his room, he would take out the photo album his aunt had rescued from his mother's house, and trace his fingers over images of Elaine holding him as a baby, Elaine at his kindergarten graduation, Elaine showing off the cake they'd baked together for his last birthday. "Where did you go, Mum?" he would whisper to the photographs. "What happened to you?" On the 1-year anniversary of Elaine's disappearance, the local newspaper ran a feature story. It recapped the known facts of the case, quoted Sheriff Holbrook saying the investigation remained open, and included a recent photograph of Thomas standing beside his aunt at a memorial service held at Millfield Memorial Hospital. The article concluded with a quote from 13-year-old Thomas. "I'm not giving up. Someday I will find out what happened to my mom. I promise." As years passed, Elaine Hartman's disappearance became part of Millfield's lore, the kind of story told to newcomers in hushed tones. "You know about the woman who vanished from the voting booth, right?" It was referenced in county election training as a reason for poll workers to remain vigilant. It appeared occasionally on true crime websites and podcasts, listed among America's most baffling unsolved disappearances. For Thomas, the mystery remained a daily presence, but its shape changed as he grew older. At 15, his grief had hardened into determination, and he began keeping a notebook of theories and questions. He interviewed people who had known his mother, collected newspaper clippings about the case, and created a timeline on his bedroom wall. Diane worried about his obsession but recognized it as his way of maintaining a connection to Elaine. She set only one rule: his investigations couldn't interfere with school. Thomas complied, maintaining honor roll status throughout high school, while continuing his private research. By the time he graduated high school in 2008, Thomas had developed a systematic approach to his mother's case. He had digitized all his notes, created a database of everyone interviewed during the initial investigation, and begun filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the case. He attended Pennsylvania State University on a partial scholarship, majoring in criminal justice with a minor in computer science. His senior thesis, titled Digital Forensics in Cold Cases, New Approaches to Historical Evidence, used his mother's disappearance as a case study. After college, Thomas was recruited by a digital forensics firm in Pittsburgh. The job allowed him to develop skills directly applicable to his ongoing investigation, while providing enough income for him to pursue leads independently. He maintained a small apartment in the city, but returned to Millfield at least once a month to follow up on local angles and visit Sheriff Holbrook, who had remained a steadfast ally despite his retirement. Throughout these years, the official investigation into Elaine Hartman's disappearance remained technically open, but effectively dormant. Occasional reviews of the evidence yielded no new insights. The case file grew thin, with months or even years between new entries. What no one realized, not Diane, not the investigators, not even Thomas himself at first, was that the answer had been waiting all along, hidden in plain sight in the most unlikely of places. November 2016 marked 14 years since Elaine Hartman had walked into voting booth number 7 and vanished. Thomas, now 26, had taken a week off work to return to Millfield for the anniversary. This had become his ritual, using the annual reminder of his loss as motivation to push forward with his investigation. The presidential election that year had brought voting to the forefront of national attention, and Thomas couldn't help but see the irony in how the very act that had taken his mother from him was being celebrated as a civic duty across the country. On the morning of November 8, 2016 Election Day, Thomas stood in the parking lot of the Millfield Community Center, watching voters stream in just as they had 14 years earlier. The building looked much the same, though the gymnasium had been renovated. Inside, voting booths, newer models than those used in 2002, were arranged in the same configuration. Booth number 7 no longer existed. They were now numbered 1 through 25 without a 7, a small concession to the superstition that had developed in the town. Thomas had not planned to vote that day. The community center held too many painful associations, and he had not requested an absentee ballot in time. But as he stood watching, a familiar figure emerged from the building. Frank Geller had been the head custodian at the community center since before Thomas was born. Now in his 70s, he walked with a slight stoop, but still moved with purpose. He spotted Thomas immediately. "Tommy Hartman," he called, using the childhood nickname that few people still used. "Thought I might see you today." They shook hands, and Frank gestured toward the building. 14 years, and it still doesn't make a lick of sense, does it? Thomas shook his head. Not even a little. Frank had been interviewed multiple times during the initial investigation. He had been on duty the morning Elaine disappeared, though he had been working in the building's basement storage areas, organizing supplies for an upcoming craft fair. Security footage confirmed he hadn't entered the gymnasium until after the alarm was raised about Elaine's abandoned purse. "You know," Frank said, his voice dropping slightly, "I'm retiring next month. 38 years taking care of this place." "Congratulations," Thomas said. "You have earned it." Frank nodded, then seemed to hesitate, looking at Thomas with an odd expression. "Something on your mind, Frank?" Thomas asked. "Been thinking about your mum's case, what with the election and all," Frank said. "And there's something, well, I have never been sure if it matters, but with me leaving." Thomas felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same rush he experienced whenever a potential new lead emerged. "Whatever it is, I'd like to hear it." Frank glanced around the parking lot, then gestured toward his small office at the side of the building. "Come on in for a minute." The custodian's office was cramped but meticulously organized, with cleaning schedules posted on the walls and supply inventories in labeled binders. Frank closed the door behind them and moved to a metal filing cabinet in the corner. "Back in '02, after your mum went missing, the police searched this whole building top to bottom," he began, pulling open the bottom drawer of the cabinet. "They looked through all my records, all the blueprints, everything." Thomas nodded. He had read the search reports multiple times, but there was one thing they never asked about, and I never thought to mention it until years later, when it seemed too late. Frank pulled out a small cardboard box, weathered and dusty. "This building, it's got a history. Built in 1953 during all that Cold War business." Thomas watched as Frank placed the box on his desk. "What does that have to do with my mom?" "Well, this place wasn't always just a community center. Original blueprints called it a civil defense facility. Fancy way of saying it was designed as a fallout shelter, among other things." Frank tapped the top of the box. "And buildings like that in those days, they sometimes had features that didn't make it onto the official plans." Thomas's heart began to race. "What kind of features?" "Escape routes. Emergency exits that wouldn't show up on standard blueprints. Cold War paranoia stuff. Frank opened the box, revealing a collection of yellowed papers. About 5 years after your mum disappeared, I was clearing out some old storage rooms and found these in a wall space behind a loose brick. Original architectural notes from the guy who designed this place. With trembling hands, Frank extracted a faded blueprint and unfolded it on the desk. Look here, underneath the gymnasium. Thomas leaned forward, studying the diagram. The blueprint showed a network of narrow passages beneath the community center maintenance tunnels, according to the labels, but with unusual features. One passage led from a point directly beneath the gymnasium to an exit nearly a quarter-mile away, emerging in a wooded area behind the town cemetery. Are you saying there was a hidden exit from the gym? One the police didn't know about? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded slowly. Not from the gym itself, but from a utility closet inside the gym. There's a trap door under the supply shelves. Leads down to these tunnels. He traced the path with his finger. When I found these plans, I went looking. The entrance was still there, hidden but accessible. Hadn't been used in decades by the look of it. Did you tell anyone? Thomas demanded, a surge of anger mixing with his shock. I called Sheriff Holbrook, even though he'd retired by then. He came and took a look, but said without evidence connecting it to your mom's case. It was just an interesting historical footnote. Frank looked genuinely remorseful. The new sheriff wasn't interested in reopening old ground, said too much time had passed. Thomas stared at the blueprint, his mind racing. The utility closet would have been just steps away from voting booth number 7. If someone had known about the hidden passage, has anyone checked these tunnels thoroughly, searched them for evidence? Thomas couldn't bring himself to say what he was really asking. Had anyone looked for his mother's remains? Sheriff Holbrook did a walkthrough with me when I showed him. Nothing obvious down there, but it's a big network of tunnels, and parts have collapsed over the years. Frank hesitated, then added, there's something else. From the box, he withdrew a small notebook. Its cover faded and water-stained. Found this down in one of the tunnels when I was showing the sheriff around. It was wedged in a crack in the wall, like someone had tried to hide it. Sheriff took a look, but said it probably wasn't related, just some old maintenance log or something. Thomas took the notebook with unsteady hands. The cover bore no markings, no name. He opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with handwritten entries, dates, and what appeared to be code names or abbreviations. I kept meaning to give you all this stuff, Frank said quietly. Just never seemed like the right time. And then years passed, with me retiring. I figured I couldn't wait any longer. Thomas flipped through the notebook, his eyes scanning the entries. Most meant nothing to him. Strings of numbers, initials, cryptic phrases. But then, on a page dated October 30th, 2002, just days before his mother's disappearance, a name jumped out at him. Elaine Hartman. His mother's name, written in unfamiliar handwriting, in a hidden notebook found in a secret tunnel beneath the place where she had vanished. Thomas looked up at Frank, his vision blurring with unshed tears. This could change everything. Frank nodded solemnly. That's why I'm giving it to you now. Maybe you can make sense of it in a way the sheriff and I couldn't. As Thomas stared down at the mysterious notebook with his mother's name written inside, questions exploded in his mind. Who had written this? What did they know about his mother? How was she connected to these hidden tunnels? And most importantly, was there finally a chance to discover what had happened to Elaine Hartman on that November morning 14 years ago? The answers, he sensed, were hidden somewhere in this unexpected discovery, in a secret box that had been waiting all along to reveal its mysteries. After 14 years of searching, Thomas Hartman might finally be on the verge of uncovering the truth about his mother's disappearance. But as he would soon discover, some truths are more dangerous than the mysteries they replace. Thomas Hartman sat in his childhood bedroom at Aunt Diane's house, the contents of Frank Geller's box spread across his desk. Night had fallen hours ago, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. The yellowed blueprints of the community center's hidden tunnel system lay unfurled beside the mysterious notebook containing his mother's name. A laptop displayed digitized copies of the original police reports, documents he had read countless times over the years, but now viewed through an entirely new lens. For 14 years, he had been searching for answers, following every possible lead, examining every angle of his mother's disappearance. And now, this unexpected discovery had blown the case wide open. The existence of secret tunnels beneath the community center changed everything about the established facts of Elaine Hartman's disappearance. The official investigation had always centered on the impossibility of Elaine leaving the gymnasium without being seen on security cameras. The emergency exit doors had been verified as unopened. The main entrance had been continuously monitored. The prevailing theory had been that Elaine must have somehow been removed from the building, though no one could explain how. But if there was a hidden entrance to underground tunnels near voting booth number 7, if someone had known about this Cold War-era escape route, then suddenly the impossible became possible. Thomas flipped through the notebook again, studying the entry that had caught his attention. The page, dated October 30th, 2002, contained several lines of text. RM confirms. Phase 2 clearance E. Hartman. Status unverified. Check medical. 11-5. Primary target. Contingency in place. Tunnel access confirmed operational. The rest of the page contained strings of numbers and abbreviations that meant nothing to Thomas. He had spent hours examining every entry in the notebook, which spanned from August 2002 to December 2002. But only this single reference to his mother had emerged. Who was RM? What was Phase 2 clearance? And most disturbing of all, why was his mother listed as a status unverified with a note to check medical? The entry seemed to suggest that Elaine had been targeted for something scheduled to occur on November 5 election day, the very day she disappeared. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This wasn't a woman who had chosen to walk away from her life. This was something planned, something organized, something that had been set in motion before election day. But by whom and why? The digital clock on his nightstand showed 3:47 a.m. Thomas knew he should try to sleep, but his mind raced with possibilities. After so many years of dead ends, he finally had a tangible lead, and he wasn't about to let it go cold. Reaching for his phone, he sent a text message to retired Sheriff Holbrook. Need to talk to you urgently about Mom's case. Frank Geller gave me some materials. Can we meet tomorrow? Then, turning back to his laptop, Thomas began a search for anyone with the initials RM, who might have had connections to Millfield. The morning brought a swift response from Jeffrey Holbrook. The retired sheriff agreed to meet Thomas at his home at 10 a.m. Holbrook now lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Millfield, where he spent his days tending to an impressive vegetable garden and, as he put it, staying out of my wife's way. At precisely 10 a.m., Thomas arrived, the box of materials from Frank tucked under his arm. Holbrook greeted him warmly. He had maintained a special relationship with Thomas over the years, checking in regularly and supporting his investigation whenever possible. He had been the one to write Thomas a recommendation letter for Penn State and had even attended his college graduation. So Frank finally shared those tunnels with you, Holbrook said, as they settled at his kitchen table. He looked older than Thomas remembered, his once dark hair now completely silver, deep lines etched around his eyes. You knew about them? Before Frank showed you? Thomas asked, unable to keep the accusatory edge from his voice. Holbrook sighed heavily. Not before your mother disappeared. No, Frank came to me about 6 years ago, showed me the blueprints, took me down there. I walked those tunnels with a flashlight and a faint hope that we might find something, anything that could explain what happened to Elaine. And the notebook? He showed you that too? Holbrook nodded. He did. I even had a friend at the state police lab examine it unofficially. The paper and ink date to the right time period, but there were no fingerprints other than Frank's. No way to tell who wrote it or what most of it means. But it has my mother's name in it, Thomas insisted, pulling out the notebook and opening it to the relevant page. Right here, just days before she disappeared. This proves she was targeted. Holbrook studied the page, his expression grave. I agree it's suspicious, Thomas, but you have to understand the position I was in. By the time Frank found these materials, the case had been cold for 8 years. I was retired. The idea that there had been some kind of conspiracy involving your mother was difficult to substantiate without more evidence. So you just gave up? Thomas couldn't hide his frustration. No, son, I never gave up, Holbrook replied firmly. I made inquiries. I looked into people with the initials RM, who might have had connections to Millfield. I researched what Phase 2 clearance might refer to. I even had the notebook analyzed for hidden writing or codes, but nothing concrete emerged. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to temper his emotions. I'm sorry. I know you did what you could. It's just, this is the closest I have come to understanding what might have happened to her. I understand. Holbrook rose and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. I have kept my own copies of everything. He withdrew a folder and returned to the table. After Frank showed me the tunnels and the notebook, I did some digging into the history of the community center. He spread several photocopied documents on the table. The building was indeed constructed in 1953 as a civil defense facility. The tunnels were part of a larger network designed to allow government officials to evacuate quickly in case of a nuclear attack. Most of these facilities were decommissioned after the Cold War, and many of the tunnels were sealed or repurposed. But the ones under the community center remained accessible, Thomas noted. Yes, though they weren't maintained. Parts have collapsed over the years. The exit point Frank showed on the blueprints, the one behind the cemetery, I found it, but it had been blocked by a cave-in sometime in the past. Thomas leaned forward. What about other exits? Could there be other ways out of the tunnel system? Holbrook hesitated. The blueprints Frank found only show the one exit, but it's possible the full network was more extensive. These facilities were often connected to other strategic locations in the area. Like what? In Millfield's case, possibly the old telephone exchange building, the water treatment plant, maybe even the hospital, places considered essential infrastructure during the Cold War. Thomas felt a chill at the mention of the hospital where his mother had worked. The hospital? Millfield Memorial? Holbrook nodded. It's possible, though I never found documentation confirming it. These tunnel systems were often kept off official records for security reasons. Thomas's mind raced with new possibilities. If the tunnels potentially connected to the hospital, and his mother had been a nurse there, I need to see these tunnels, he said decisively. Holbrook frowned. Thomas, they are not safe. Parts have collapsed, and there's no proper ventilation. Without proper equipment, I will get proper equipment, Thomas interrupted. But I need to see them. Today, if possible. The retired sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. I know that look. You have got your mother's determination. Frank still has access to the community center. I will call him, see if he can meet us there this afternoon. Thank you, Thomas said, his resolve hardening. After 14 years of searching for answers, he wasn't about to stop, now not when he was finally getting close to the truth. The utility closet in the Millfield Community Center gymnasium looked utterly ordinary, metal shelving stocked with cleaning supplies, a mop sink in the corner, a pegboard hung with tools. Frank Geller moved aside several boxes on the bottom shelf, revealing a square outline in the concrete floor. Trap doors underneath here, he explained, grunting as he shifted the heavy boxes. Haven't opened it since I showed the sheriff 6 years ago. Thomas and Holbrook, both dressed in work clothes and equipped with hard hats, heavy-duty flashlights and dust masks, watched as Frank cleared the space. Thomas had also brought a backpack containing water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and his camera. Frank knelt on the floor, his arthritic fingers finding a recessed metal ring. With effort, he pulled, and the trap door lifted to reveal a dark opening and a set of metal rungs embedded in the wall of a shaft. "Goes down about 15 feet, Frank said, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Then there's a maintenance tunnel that branches off in different directions." Thomas peered down the shaft, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination. Somewhere in this hidden network of tunnels might lie the answer to what had happened to his mother. The thought both terrified and compelled him. "I will go first," Holbrook said, adjusting his hard hat. Despite being in his 60s, the retired sheriff moved with the confidence of a man who had kept himself fit. "Frank, you stay up here in case we need anything. Thomas, you follow me, but stay close." Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly dry. As Holbrook descended the ladder, Thomas turned to Frank. "Thank you for this, for everything." The old custodian nodded solemnly. "Should have shown you years ago. Maybe you will find something we missed." Thomas followed Holbrook down the ladder, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew cooler and damp as he descended, carrying the musty scent of long undisturbed earth. At the bottom, his feet touched concrete, and he found himself in a narrow tunnel with walls of poured concrete, now stained with decades of mineral deposits and mold. "This way," Holbrook said, gesturing down the main passage. The tunnel branches about 50 yards ahead. They moved cautiously through the passageway, their flashlight beams revealing pipes running along the ceiling and electrical conduits embedded in the walls. Decades-old graffiti occasionally appeared, dates, initials, and crude symbols left by long-forgotten maintenance workers or perhaps civil defense personnel. At the junction, 3 tunnels branched off in different directions. Faded directional signs, barely legible after years of moisture damage, marked each passage: main facility, auxiliary exit, and utility access. "Frank and I explored the auxiliary exit tunnel last time," Holbrook said, pointing to the middle passage. "It's collapsed about 200 yards in, blocking the exit route to the cemetery." "What about the others?" Thomas asked, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "We checked the main facility tunnel briefly. It just leads back to other parts of the community center. The utility access tunnel? We didn't get far. It narrows considerably and there's standing water in parts." Frank was concerned about structural integrity. Thomas directed his flashlight beam down the utility access tunnel. This was the passage that might potentially lead toward other facilities, possibly even the hospital where his mother had worked. "I want to try that one," he said, already moving toward the utility access passage. Holbrook hesitated but followed. "Stay alert for any signs of instability. If I say we turn back, no arguments." The utility access tunnel was noticeably narrower than the main passage, forcing them to walk single file. The ceiling height decreased as well, requiring Thomas to duck his head in places. Their flashlights revealed electrical junction boxes at intervals along the walls, their metal doors corroded and hanging open, exposing ancient wiring. After about 100 yards, they encountered the standing water. Holbrook had mentioned a section of tunnel where the floor dipped, creating a pool about 10 feet across and of indeterminate depth. "This is as far as Frank and I got," Holbrook said. "We didn't have waders, and we weren't about to risk electrocution if any of these old wires were still live." Thomas shone his flashlight across the water's surface, noting how the tunnel continued beyond. "We need to get past this." Holbrook looked skeptical. "Thomas, we don't know how deep it is or what's under the surface. There might be something on the other side, something that could explain what happened to my mother." Thomas was already removing his backpack, searching for anything that might help them gauge the water's depth. Finding a length of PVC pipe on the ground nearby, Thomas carefully extended it into the water. The pipe went in about 2 feet before hitting solid ground. "It's not that deep," he said, "and I'm wearing waterproof boots. I'm going to try crossing." Before Holbrook could protest further, Thomas stepped cautiously into the water. It rose to just above his knees at the deepest point, soaking the bottom of his jeans, but not overtopping his boots. Carefully, he waded across, testing each step before committing his weight. When he reached the other side, he turned back to Holbrook. "It's safe to cross. The bottom is solid." Holbrook, shaking his head but unwilling to let Thomas continue alone, followed the same path across. On the other side, they found the tunnel continued for another 50 yards before ending at a heavy metal door, rusted, but still intact. "This wasn't on the blueprints Frank showed me," Thomas said, examining the door. A faded sign above read "Outside personnel only." "Could be a maintenance access point for another facility," Holbrook suggested, studying the door's corroded hinges. "But it looks like it hasn't been opened in decades." Thomas ran his flashlight over the door's surface, noticing a keypad mounted beside it, an electronic security measure that seemed anachronistic in the aging tunnel system. "This is newer than the rest of this place," he noted, examining the keypad. Unlike the door, it showed less corrosion, suggesting it had been installed or replaced more recently than the original construction. Cold War facilities were often updated during the 1980s, Holbrook commented. Reagan administration pumped money into civil defense. Thomas tried the door handle, but as expected, it didn't budge. The keypad beside it was dark, apparently without power. "We need to get through this door," Thomas said, a sense of urgency building within him. Something about this hidden, secured access point raised his suspicions. Why would a simple maintenance tunnel require electronic security? Examining the hinges more carefully, Thomas noticed they were severely corroded. If we had something to use as a pry bar, we might be able to force it open. Holbrook hesitated, then reached into his back pocket and produced a folding tactical knife with a sturdy blade. "Try this in the gap near the hinges. Might give us enough leverage." Thomas worked the knife blade into the narrow space between the door and its frame, applying pressure gradually. The aged metal groaned in protest, but after several attempts, he felt something give. A loud crack echoed through the tunnel as one of the hinges separated from the frame. "That's it," Holbrook encouraged, moving forward to help. Together, they worked on the remaining hinges until, with a final metallic shriek, the door pulled free from its frame. Beyond lay another tunnel, this one clearly different from those they had traversed so far. The walls were lined with white ceramic tile rather than bare concrete, and recessed lighting fixtures dotted the ceiling, though they were dark now. The floor was smooth, polished concrete, unmarked by the water damage and debris they had encountered elsewhere. "This doesn't look like a maintenance tunnel," Thomas said quietly, his flashlight beam revealing a much more finished space than the rough utility passages behind them. "No," Holbrook agreed, his voice tense. "This looks like it was designed for regular use." They proceeded cautiously down the tiled corridor, which maintained a slight downward grade. After approximately 200 yards, they reached another door, this one modern, made of steel with a small window at eye level. Unlike the previous door, this one bore no visible signs of aging or disuse. Thomas approached the window and shone his flashlight through the glass. Beyond was a small antechamber with another door on the far side. The walls were painted institutional green, and a desk sat to one side, bare except for an outdated computer monitor and keyboard. "This looks maintained," Thomas said, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cool tunnel air. "Recently maintained." Holbrook joined him at the window, his expression grim. "I don't like this, Thomas. This goes beyond abandoned Cold War infrastructure. Someone's been using these tunnels." Thomas tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open smoothly, without the resistance or noise they had encountered with the previous barrier. Inside the antechamber, the air felt different, filtered, climate-controlled. Moving to the desk, Thomas examined the computer setup. The monitor was an older CRT model, but not ancient, perhaps from the early 2000s. A fine layer of dust covered the keyboard, suggesting it hadn't been used very recently, but certainly more recently than the decades-old equipment they had passed in the tunnels. "Sheriff," Thomas called, his voice tight. "Look at this." On the wall behind the desk hung a framed photograph that made Thomas's blood run cold. It showed a group of people in business attire, standing in front of the Millfield Community Center. The photo appeared to be from the late 1990s, judging by the clothing styles and the appearance of the building before its early 2000s renovation. But what had caught Thomas's attention was a face in the second row, a face he knew intimately from years of study. His mother, Elaine Hartman, standing among a group of people he didn't recognize. "That's my mother," he said, removing the frame from the wall with trembling hands. But she never mentioned being part of any group connected to the community center. She wasn't on any committees, wasn't involved in local politics at all. Holbrook studied the photograph, his expression darkening. "I recognize some of these people. This man here," he pointed to a tall, distinguished-looking man in the center of the front row. "That's Richard Mercer. He was the hospital administrator at Millfield Memorial until around 2. Thomas felt a jolt. Richard Mercer, RM from the notebook. Possibly, Holbrook conceded. But what would the hospital administrator have to do with secret tunnels under the community center? Thomas flipped the frame over and removed the backing, hoping for some notation on the photograph itself. There was nothing written on the back, but a small folded piece of paper fell out from behind the photo. Unfolding it, Thomas found a typewritten list of names with dates beside them. His mother's name was there, Elaine Hartman, but more chilling were the dozen or so other names on the list, all with dates beside them, ranging from 1998 to 2004. Thomas didn't recognize most of them, but the final entry made his heart skip a beat. Thomas Hartman, pending authorization. His own name, without a date but clearly listed as some kind of target. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, showing the list to Holbrook. The retired sheriff's face paled as he read the document. "Thomas, we need to get out of here. Now, whatever this is, it's bigger and more current than I imagined." But Thomas was already moving toward the second door, the one leading deeper into whatever facility lay beyond the antechamber. "My mother came through here, Sheriff. She was part of whatever this is. I need to know more." "Thomas, wait." But Thomas had already pushed through the door, finding himself in a corridor lined with numbered doors. It resembled nothing so much as a hospital ward, though smaller and more confined than a typical medical facility. The corridor stretched about 50 feet before ending at a final door marked Records. Thomas moved quickly to this door, aware of Holbrook following reluctantly behind him. The records room was unlocked, revealing a space filled with filing cabinets and shelves of 3-ring binders. A thick layer of dust covered everything, suggesting this room, unlike the antechamber, had been untouched for years. "Look for anything with my mother's name," Thomas instructed, already pulling open the nearest filing cabinet. Holbrook, despite his misgivings, began examining the binders on the shelves. After several minutes of searching, Thomas found a drawer labeled HK and rifled through the files until he located one labeled Hartman E. With shaking hands, he withdrew the folder and opened it on a nearby desk. Inside was a collection of medical records, psychological evaluations, and what appeared to be surveillance reports, all concerning his mother. The earliest documents dated to 1994, 2 years after Thomas was born. The most recent was dated October 28, 2002, just days before Elaine disappeared. "Sheriff," Thomas called, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." Holbrook joined him at the desk, and together they examined the contents of Elaine's file. The documents painted a disturbing picture. Elaine Hartman had been part of something called Project Mnemosyne, described in the paperwork as a controlled study of targeted memory modification and cognitive restructuring. One document, a psychological evaluation from 1998, noted, "Subject continues to demonstrate exceptional resilience to protocol. Recommends increased dosage of compound MNX7 during Phase 2 trial." Another, A medical report from 2001 stated, "Subject shows concerning signs of protocol degradation. Memory barriers becoming permeable. Recommend full reset if symptoms persist." The most recent document, the one from October 2002, was a simple form with a check box beside the words "Terminal Protocol Approved" and a signature at the bottom, R. Mercer, Administrative Director. Thomas stared at the document, unable to process what he was reading. Terminal Protocol. The cold, clinical phrase seemed to hang in the air between them. "They killed her," he finally said, his voice hollow with shock and grief. Whatever this project was, she was part of it, and then they decided to terminate her. Holbrook, his face ashen, continued examining the file. "Thomas, there's more here. Look at this." He pulled out an older document, dated 1992, the year Thomas was born. It was a birth record, but not the standard hospital form. This document classified infant male Hartman as Generation 2 test subject, and included the notation, "Genetic profile confirms inheritance of targeted markers, subject to be monitored for spontaneous manifestation." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming in his mind. "I think," Holbrook said carefully, "it means you were part of this too. Whatever they were doing with your mother, they were interested in whether it had affected you genetically." Thomas turned to the list they had found behind the photograph, the one with his name marked pending authorization. A cold understanding washed over him. "They were planning to do to me whatever they did to her," he said. "But something changed after she disappeared. Maybe too much attention on the case, too many questions being asked." Holbrook nodded grimly. "So they suspended their plans for you, at least temporarily." Thomas continued searching through the filing cabinet, looking for anything else connected to his mother or himself. In a drawer marked Administrative, he found a thin file labeled Contingency Protocols. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of numbered procedures. Item 3 caught his attention immediately. In case of subject non-compliance or protocol failure, the election day extraction method provides optimal coverage. Community center access via booth N7 ensures minimal witness exposure and maximum deniability. Thomas felt physically ill. They planned it all. The voting booth, election day, all of it. They knew exactly how to make her disappear. But why? Holbrook asked. Still examining other files. What was this project trying to accomplish? Thomas returned to his mother's file, searching for anything that might explain the purpose of Project Mnemosyne. Near the bottom of the stack, he found a document titled Initial Recruitment Assessment. It described Elaine as an ideal candidate due to her exceptional memory patterns and cognitive resilience. Another document, a research summary from 1997, provided more clues. Subjects exposed to compound MNX7 demonstrate remarkable ability to compartmentalize memories and access cognitive states on command. Military applications include covert operations requiring perfect recall under stress and complete memory suppression during interrogation. A military project, Thomas said, the pieces falling into place. They were developing some kind of memory control drug, using my mother as a test subject. And they were interested in whether these effects could be passed to offspring, Holbrook added, gesturing to the document about Thomas's birth. Thomas sat heavily in a nearby chair, overwhelmed by what they were discovering. For 14 years, he had imagined countless scenarios explaining his mother's disappearance, abduction, foul play, even the remote possibility that she had chosen to leave. But this, a secret government research project, memory manipulation, planned termination, it was beyond anything he could have conceived. "Where did they take her?" he asked, voicing the question that still remained unanswered. "After they extracted her from the voting booth. Where did she go?" They continued searching through the records room, looking for anything that might indicate Elaine's fate after November 5, 2002. In a cabinet labeled Completed Protocols, Thomas found a thin folder with his mother's name. Inside was a single document, a transport order dated November 5, 2002, authorizing the relocation of Subject E. Hartman to Facility Omega for terminal protocol implementation. At the bottom was a handwritten note: protocol completed, subject remains interred at Omega site per standard procedure. Thomas stared at the paper, the clinical language barely masking the horror of what it described. His mother had been taken to some facility called Omega, where she had been killed and buried, all within 24 hours of her disappearance from the voting booth. "We need to find out where Facility Omega is," Thomas said, his grief giving way to a cold determination. There might still be evidence there, proof of what they did. Holbrook was examining a large binder labeled Facility Directories. "I think I found it," he said after a moment. "Facility Omega is listed here as deep storage and medical waste disposal. The address is Thomas. It's on the grounds of Millfield Memorial Hospital." "The hospital where she worked," Thomas said, pieces continuing to fall into place. "They kept her close, monitored her daily, and when they decided to terminate her, they had a disposal facility right there." "We should take these documents to the FBI," Holbrook said, gathering the most relevant files. "This goes far beyond local jurisdiction. This is a government-backed project that's been operating in secret for decades." Thomas nodded absently, still processing the revelations. His mother hadn't simply vanished. She had been systematically monitored, experimented on, and ultimately eliminated when she no longer served the project's purposes. And he himself had been marked as the next generation of test subject, spared only by the attention his mother's disappearance had generated. As they prepared to leave with their evidence, Thomas noticed a final cabinet he hadn't yet examined. It was smaller than the others and located in a corner of the room, partially hidden behind a shelving unit. The drawer was labeled simply Active Subjects. With a growing sense of dread, Thomas opened the drawer. Inside were only 3 files. He pulled them out and spread them on the desk. The first was labeled Hartman T., his own file. The second bore the name Reynolds D., his father, who had left when Thomas was 3 years old. And the third was labeled Hartman E., Clone Series 2. With trembling hands, Thomas opened this third file. Inside was a collection of medical reports and monitoring logs, all dated after 2002, after his mother had supposedly been terminated. The most recent entry was from 2015, just a year before. Included in the file was a photograph that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. It showed a woman who was unmistakably his mother, though her hair was gray now and her face more lined. She was sitting in what appeared to be a hospital room, staring blankly at a television. The timestamp on the photo read, "She's alive," Thomas whispered, showing the photograph to Holbrook. "Or, something like her is alive." Holbrook studied the photo and the accompanying documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Thomas, these records, they are talking about cloning, genetic duplication. This file suggests they created a copy of your mother, one without her memories or personality, to continue their research after terminating the original. Or maybe they never killed her at all," Thomas countered, desperately clinging to hope. "Maybe they just wiped her memories, made her forget who she was, who I was." Holbrook looked unconvinced. "The terminal protocol documentation is pretty clear, but either way, these records indicate that someone or something genetically identical to your mother is being kept at this facility Omega." Thomas gathered all 3 files from the active subjects drawer. "We are going there. Now. Today. Thomas, we need to be careful. If this project is still active, these people are dangerous. They have already demonstrated they are willing to abduct and possibly kill to protect their secrets." "I have spent 14 years searching for my mother," Thomas said, his voice hard with resolve. "If there's even a chance she's alive, the real her, not some clone, I have to find out." As they prepared to leave the records room with their evidence, a sound from the corridor outside froze them in place, the distinct click of a door opening, followed by footsteps. Someone else was in the facility. Holbrook immediately dimmed his flashlight and gestured for Thomas to do the same. They stood in tense silence as the footsteps grew closer. "Annual inspection complete," a male voice said, apparently speaking into a phone or radio. "Facility remains secure. No signs of intrusion or compromise." Thomas and Holbrook exchanged alarmed glances. The voice continued, "Heading to records now for inventory verification. Then we'll proceed to Omega for subject check." The footsteps were now just outside the records room door. Thomas and Holbrook pressed themselves against the wall beside the door, hoping to remain unseen if the person entered. The door swung open, and a beam of light swept across the room. A man in a security uniform stepped inside, still speaking into his radio. "Yes, sir. We'll confirm all files." The guard stopped abruptly, his flashlight beam falling on the open filing cabinets and the documents spread across the desk. For a moment he stood frozen in shock. "Security breach," he shouted into his radio. "Records room has been—" He never finished the sentence. Holbrook, moving with surprising speed for his age, tackled the guard from behind. The man's radio and flashlight clattered to the floor as they struggled. Thomas rushed to help, but before he could reach them, the guard broke free of Holbrook's grip and reached for his sidearm. In the dim light, Thomas saw the gleam of a pistol being drawn. "Sheriff," he shouted in warning. What happened next unfolded in seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. Holbrook lunged forward again. The guard raised his weapon. A single gunshot echoed deafeningly in the confined space of the records room. The guard collapsed to the floor, his pistol discharging a second time as he fell, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Holbrook stood over him, breathing heavily, one hand pressed to his side where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. "Sheriff, you are hit," Thomas said, rushing to his side. "It's not bad," Holbrook grimaced, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "But we need to move. Now." That radio call went through. "More will be coming." Thomas quickly gathered the most crucial files, shoving them into his backpack. He helped Holbrook to the door, supporting the older man as they moved as quickly as possible back toward the antechamber and the tunnel beyond. "We need to get to Facility Omega," Thomas insisted as they hurried along the tiled corridor. "It's our only chance to find out the truth about my mother." "Thomas," Holbrook said, his voice weakening, "we need to get help first. These files are evidence of criminal activity at the highest levels. We need to secure them, get them to people who can act on them safely." They reached the antechamber just as alarms began to sound in the facility behind them. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor in an eerie glow. "They are locking down," Holbrook warned. "We need to move faster." They pushed through the first door, back into the rough utility tunnel they had navigated earlier. Thomas supported Holbrook as best he could, the retired sheriff growing heavier against him as they moved. The wound in his side continued to bleed, leaving a trail of dark droplets on the concrete floor. "Almost there," Thomas encouraged as they approached the flooded section of tunnel. "Just a little further." But as they reached the water, flashlight beams appeared in the tunnel behind them, accompanied by shouts. "Security! Stop where you are!" Thomas helped Holbrook into the water, both of them moving as quickly as possible through the knee-deep flood. Behind them, the security team was closing fast. "Go," Holbrook gasped as they reached the far side of the water. "Take the files and go. I will hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas insisted. "You have to," Holbrook said firmly. "This is bigger than both of us now. You have evidence of what happened to your mother, evidence of a government program that abducted and possibly killed American citizens. You need to get it out, make it public." Before Thomas could protest further, Holbrook reached into his pocket and pressed something into Thomas's hand, his car keys. "My car's in the community center lot. Get to it, drive to Pittsburgh, find Agent Walsh at the FBI. She will know what to do." He grimaced in pain but managed a determined smile. "Finish this, Thomas. For your mother, for all of them." The flashlight beams were drawing closer. With a final nod of understanding, Thomas turned and moved as quickly as he could down the tunnel, away from the approaching security team. Behind him, he heard Holbrook call out, "Federal agent, drop your weapons." It was a lie. Holbrook had been retired for years, but it might buy precious seconds of confusion. Thomas heard shouting, then 2 more gunshots echoed through the tunnel. He forced himself not to look back, not to think about what those shots might mean. The climb up the ladder beneath the utility closet seemed endless, his muscles burning with exertion and adrenaline. Finally, he emerged into the closet, startling Frank Geller, who was keeping watch. "Where's the sheriff?" Frank asked, alarmed. "No time," Thomas gasped. "Security team coming. We need to leave. Now." They hurried from the utility closet into the gymnasium, now filled with early evening volleyball practice. The sudden appearance of 2 disheveled men from a closet caused a momentary pause in the activity, but Thomas and Frank moved quickly through the gym and out into the main hallway. "My car's in the back lot," Frank said. "This way," but Thomas shook his head, holding up Holbrook's keys. "I need to take his car. There are people after us, Frank. Dangerous people. You should get somewhere safe." The old custodian looked confused and frightened, but nodded. "What about Jeffrey?" Thomas couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened in the tunnels. "I will call you when I can," he promised, already moving toward the exit. Outside, the November evening had brought early darkness. Thomas jogged across the parking lot to Holbrook's sedan, constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, forcing himself to drive at a normal speed, despite the urge to floor the accelerator. In his rearview mirror, he saw emergency vehicles arriving at the community center, not police cars, but unmarked black SUVs with government plates. Whatever Project Mnemosyne was, it had resources and reach. As he drove toward the highway that would take him to Pittsburgh and the FBI office where he hoped to find Agent Walsh, Thomas thought about the files in his backpack. They contained the truth about his mother's disappearance, a truth far more sinister than he had ever imagined. Government experimentation, memory manipulation, cloning, and somewhere in a facility called Omega on the grounds of Millfield Memorial Hospital, someone who shared his mother's DNA was being held. Was it really his mother, her memories erased but somehow still alive? Or was it, as the files suggested, a clone created to continue the research after the original Elaine Hartman had been terminated? Thomas didn't know. But after 14 years of searching, he was finally close to answers, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the full truth, no matter how dark it might be. As he merged onto the highway, his phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller. With a sense of foreboding, Thomas answered, putting the call on speaker. "Hello?" There was a moment of static, then a woman's voice, familiar yet distant, like an echo from the past. "Thomas, is that you?" His breath caught in his throat. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 14 years, but would recognize anywhere. "Mum," he whispered. "Thomas, listen carefully," the voice continued, tension evident in every word. "They are coming for you. They have always been watching you. The files you took, they are just the beginning. There's so much more you don't know." "Mum, where are you? Are you really alive?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "I don't have much time," she replied, ignoring his questions. "There's a tracker in your left shoulder. They implanted it when you were a child. They have been monitoring you your entire life, waiting to see if you developed the same abilities I did." "What abilities?" "Mom, please, find Dr. Lillian Carter. She worked on the project but got out. She can help you understand what they did to me, what they might have done to you." Her voice grew more urgent. "And Thomas, whatever you do, don't trust." The call cut off abruptly. Thomas stared at the phone in shock, his mind reeling from what he'd just heard. His mother's voice after 14 years of silence. In his rearview mirror, he noticed headlights approaching rapidly, a large black SUV gaining on him with alarming speed. As the vehicle drew closer, Thomas made a split-second decision and veered onto an exit ramp, tires squealing in protest. The SUV followed, confirming his suspicions. These were the same people who had been at the community center, the people behind Project Mnemosyne, and they were coming for him. The chase was on. But as Thomas navigated the unfamiliar roads, trying to lose his pursuers, his mind kept returning to his mother's voice and her unfinished warning. Don't trust. Don't trust. Who? What had she been trying to tell him? After 14 years of searching for his mother, Thomas Hartman had finally found a fragment of her, just a voice on the phone, but undeniably her. Yet this discovery had only deepened the mystery and placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the very people who had taken her from him. As the black SUV closed the distance behind him, Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter, determination hardening within him. He would find Dr. Lillian Carter. He would discover the truth about Project Mnemosyne. He would learn what had really happened to his mother in voting booth number 7 on that November morning 14 years ago. And then he would make them pay.